Hi everyone, this is Dr. Hall. So we finished up talking about parasitic and bacterial STIs, and now we're going to move into the viral infections, talking about two different viruses, herpes and HIV, in lecture 25. Before we do a quick review, so our parasitic infections, remember those are unique because they can be transmitted by fomites, things like underwear, towels, toilet seats, tanning beds, and they're all treated with prescription medications and curable. We talked about trichomonas, which can cause a vaginitis, pubic lice, which are like head lice but in a different place, and scabies, which is not technically an STI but in college students is usually transmitted that way. We also talked about the bacterial infections, which as a group can be treated and cured with antibiotics and require really direct transmission. So fomites aren't going to work in the case of bacterial infections. Also with the bacterial infections, you can get them more than once. Same thing for the parasitic ones. Syphilis has a variety of symptoms. Remember primary syphilis with the painless ulcer called a chancre, then secondary syphilis where you can get a rash, you can have flu-like symptoms, you can get weird warts, and then it can go latent, and then you can get tertiary syphilis where it can infect the brain, the heart, the soft tissues. Syphilis is also of interest because of a shameful episode in American history with the Tuskegee study, where people were studied who had syphilis without understanding exactly what they were signing up for. Also in that study, even though penicillin was discovered to treat syphilis, the participants in the study were not treated or informed that that was available for them. After that debacle, we have instituted safety protocols for human subjects research with something called an institutional review board so that this doesn't happen again. We also talked about chlamydia, which is the most common of the bacterial STIs because it's super sneaky. It's asymptomatic in 50 to 75% of people who have it, so it's very easy for them to transmit it to others. Therefore, screening is recommended for most sexually active adults aged 25 and under. Gonorrhea is very much like chlamydia in that it also can cause a cervicitis, a urethritis, a vaginitis, but it tends to be more symptomatic, and so it is less common because people realize pretty quickly something is wrong. The one exception to that would be rectal infections with gonorrhea. They are often asymptomatic. Another difference with gonorrhea is that that one can also infect the throat. So when we're talking about both chlamydia and gonorrhea, it's important that testing be performed at all potential sites of exposure. So vaginal, rectal, and for gonorrhea, throat, urine for male-bodied people, because you can otherwise miss it. All right, moving on. So we're moving into the viral infections. Viruses are the smallest of our infectious agents. They're teeny, 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 tiny. Can't see them with a typical microscope. And this is an electron micrograph of the first virus that we're going to talk about. Kind of looks like a fried egg. This is herpes. So in our first section of this lecture, we're going to talk about the history of herpes, which is pretty interesting, I think. So it turns out that herpes has been with humans for a very long time. They've discovered ancient Sumerian tablets where people talked about herpes. These are tablets from like 2000 BC. And it's named herpes comes from the Greek and it means to creep. And this is Emperor Tiberius of Rome. And it said that at one time he banned kissing in Rome. He said, everybody stop kissing because too many people have herpes on their lips. So nobody's able to kiss anymore. And then in Romeo and Juliet, right, so Shakespeare's play written in the 1500s, he talks about blisters, quote, o'er ladies' lips, right? So he's talking about oral herpes in that situation. And in Victorian England in the 1800s, herpes was actually listed as a, quote, vocational disease of women. Now, a vocational disease is a disease that you catch because of your work, and the only real profession available to women at that time was, of course, prostitution. So this was an occupational hazard for the prostitutes of the day. So we have a really, really long history with herpes. It's been with humans forever. It causes these cold sore-like symptoms that can be on your mouth or on your genitals or anal region. It's uncomfortable, but yet it's rarely dangerous. So this is just that information again, if you wanted to review it. And so for most of human history, herpes was an uncomfortable and unpleasant part of life. It was just a fact of life. A lot of people got at least one type of it at one point in time. In the 1970s, however, an interesting thing occurred. So a pharmaceutical company invented and developed the drug acyclovir. Acyclovir is an antiviral medication, and they found that it could help decrease the severity and duration of an outbreak of herpes sores. The problem was nobody was really buying the medicine. Nobody was going to their doctors to get a prescription for it because people were just used to the idea that, yeah, herpes just sometimes happens and what can you do? So thus began a public education campaign. So the pharmaceutical industry, as well as some medical groups, as well as the media, kind of got together and said, well, we need to bring attention to the fact that herpes is this horrible disease that can be treated. So all of a sudden we start seeing all these kind of major media organizations doing front page stories, right? So here's Time Magazine, today's scarlet letter, herpes, in big red, ugly looking letters. And one of my favorites is this one. So this was like an after school special, right? This is like a made for TV movie called Intimate Agony, right? So here's our doctor that's going to be telling us about genital herpes. So there was a lot of press about how horrible this disease was. And so, before this, it was really not talked about or not stigmatized, right? It was just a cold sore in a weird place, right? But once there was no market for this drug, we started seeing these public education campaigns and media coverage in the late 70s into the early 80s. And so here is an excerpt from another article in Time Magazine, aside from the one I showed you the cover of. So the title of this one was Herpes, the New Sexual Leprosy, with the subtitle, Viruses of Love Infect Millions with Disease and Despair. So here's some quotes from the article. Susan knew her boyfriend had a herpes infection and consulted her gynecologist about whether it was safe to have sex. The doctor reassured her that herpes was only contagious if her partner had festering sores. Susan slept with him, and within a week, she got herpes. Such is the predicament, indeed the pathos, right? We're using such big words here, of herpes, one of the most common venereal diseases, or STIs, in the US today, possibly even more widespread than gonorrhea. Yes, absolutely. This year, up to 500,000 more Americans will develop the telltale genital blisters of herpes, adding to the 5 to 14 million who already have the disease. When they seek medical help, they will often be given incorrect information or false hopes for cures. Most will suffer shame, guilt, and even depression, and a few will become suicidal over what they feel is the new leprosy, right? So this is taking a problem of cold sores in an inconvenient place and painting it as a horrible, world-ending kind of infection, which it isn't. I mean, it's not fun, but it's not the worst thing that can happen to you by far. So this is an example of something called disease mongering. And this was so well put by this article in British Medical Journal in 2002 that I'm going to actually again quote their article. So they say within many disease categories, informal alliances have emerged with drug company staff, doctors, and consumer groups, ostensibly, so theoretically, engaged in raising public awareness about underdiagnosed and undertreated problems. These alliances tend to promote a view of this particular condition as widespread, serious, and treatable. And because these disease awareness campaigns are commonly linked to companies' marketing strategies, they end up de facto operating to expand markets for new pharmaceutical products. In other words, to help sell the drugs. Alternative approaches, emphasizing the self-limiting, meaning it goes away on its own, it's temporary, or relatively benign, meaning harmless, natural history of a problem, or the importance of personal coping strategies are played down or ignored. As writer Lynn Payer observed, disease mongers gnaw away at our self-confidence. And I would say it kind of gnaws away at your self-efficacy or your sense of your ability of being able to cope with something as like, this is just part of life. I'm not saying that these medicines aren't helpful, but I am saying that sometimes the way they paint these diseases as these horrendous, horrible, terrible, serious things is way overblown, and it actually undermines people's ability to cope with these things when they almost inevitably occur. So, especially because this disease is really common. So there are two subtypes of HSV, HSV1 and HSV2. We'll talk about those more in the next section of the lecture. But in short, HSV1 causes the cold sores or fever blisters that people get on their lips, right? And what we're looking at here is prevalence, the percentage of the population that tests positive for antibodies, meaning they've previously been infected with these different subtypes. So the upper curve is HSV1. And look at this, by age 5, more than 50% of Americans have already been exposed to HSV1, right? This is because Aunt Sally was kissing you on the cheek and she has HSV1 and so you get it, or your parents, right? We kiss babies and children a lot. So they get infected pretty quickly. And then we see continued increases such that by the time you're 35, more than 90% of people have already been exposed to the HSV1 virus, whether or not they ever actually get fever blisters or not. HSV2 in this particular study is also very common, but less so. So in this study, they saw that, about 20% of people by the age of 50 seem to become infected with HSV2, which classically causes genital herpes. So 1 in 5, it's still a lot, right? This is common. So I thought this chart was really interesting, and it's actually showing us a lot of different data, so I'm going to kind of break it down for you. First of all, you can see on the left hand versus the right hand sides, we have two different ethnic or racial groups, right? So non-Hispanic whites on the left and non-Hispanic blacks on the right. And then the different colors, the dark blue is from 1976 to 1980, and then as they get lighter, right, we're looking at different time periods within different age categories all the way up to 2005 to 2008, which was the most recent study of prevalence data. So this is like we talked about before, where researchers go out and knock on people's doors and say, hello, may I please draw your blood or have you pee in a cup or swab your vagina, right? These happen to be blood tests looking for antibodies to this virus. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But what you can see, and what I really want you to take away from this, is that over time, the numbers of people who get HSV2 are about the same, right? So the different colored bars, those confidence intervals overlap. There's no statistically significant difference in the prevalence of people who have HSV2 over time. The other interesting thing that we can see is, of course, that the longer you live, the more likely you are to get infected. We would expect that. We also see the difference that we see in different racial and ethnic groups, and that harkens back to what we've talked about before, where your risk of contracting a disease depends on large part in the prevalence on your particular subcommunity or communities. And so the take-home message here, which you can see, is that by age 30, 20 to 50% of adults, depending on your subcommunity, have been infected with HSV2. This is really common. Here's another chart that kind of takes things past that 2008. So again, this is looking at prevalence data, looking at adolescents and adults, so all people ages 14 to 49. And what we can see is that actually in this particular study, look, HSV1 is much lower than in that previous study. and here's HSV2. And so what we can see is that if anything, the prevalence of these two herpes infections is actually decreasing over time. So it's at least staying stable or perhaps actually becoming less prevalent, less common over time. And yet, the numbers of visits to doctors' offices has gone up for genital herpes, right? So it's becoming less common, but more people are going to the doctor for it. So we can see, right, so very few people went to the doctor for herpes before, let me get my little drawing tool, right, before the public education campaigns, right? And then we see a steady increase since with some little peaks. This is when a new medicine, Valtrex, came out that was easier to take because it was once or twice a day instead of 5 times a day. So, so certainly those campaigns work. I'm not saying this is all necessarily a bad thing. These medications are helpful, and I think it's good that people are able to get access to things to help treat this infection, but it's interesting to think about. So in summary, herpes has been with humans for thousands and thousands of years. It causes cold sores, sometimes on your mouth and sometimes on your genitals. And then in the 1970s, when a pharmaceutical treatment became developed, in order to increase the market for their medication, they had to say, this is a really bad, horrible thing. You should go to your doctor and get this medicine which can help. And it can, so it's not always a bad thing, but this concept of disease mongering, which can also undermine our own innate ability to kind of cope with and deal with the flings and arrows of life and the bad things that happen to us. So doctors' visits and sales of medication have gone up. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but making people feel like this is the worst thing that could ever happen to them, that is definitely a bad thing. The actual prevalence of the virus has not increased. It is not becoming more common, but it is very, very common just to begin with. So HSV2, at least 1 in 5 people, and HSV1, more than 90% of the population. All right, so we'll pick up with 25B, talking about the infection itself, its symptoms, and treatments.